In 2016, between his bizarre, rights-retaining Dick Tracy TV specials of 2010 and 2023, Hollywood icon Warren Beatty returned from his self-imposed filmmaking exile to write, direct, and star in the romantic drama Rules Don't Apply. Beatty had more or less retired from motion pictures after the disastrous response to 2001's Town and Country, and despite his occasional comments about still wanting to do another Dick Tracy movie, many truly began to wonder if he was done with movies for good. So it's kind of surprising that sheer curiosity about his return alone wasn't enough to propel his comeback film to success. Rules Don't Apply received ambivalent reviews, and grossed only $4 million, against a budget of $25. The sort of box office bomb we'd certainly do on this show, if not for the fact that it was just a standalone and not an attempted franchise starter. And yet, while no sequels were intended, Beatty was playing a character so prolific in cinema you could almost cobble together a sort of unofficial film franchise around the man. For what ultimately drew Beatty back to filmmaking with Rules Don't Apply was the opportunity to play famed American aviator Howard Hughes. Hughes is no stranger to Hollywood, and vice versa. In various biopics and fictional imaginings of his life, Hughes has been played by a handful of well-known leading men, including Tommy Lee Jones, Jason Robards, Dean Stockwell, and Leonardo DiCaprio. But the real-life Hughes was also inextricably linked to Tinseltown. Between 1927 and 1957, Hughes produced a number of high-profile movies, including the original 1932 Scarface and the 1930 war classic Hell's Angels, for which Hughes also directed the film's stunning aviation scenes, while Frankenstein director James Whale handled the dialogue. For a time, Hughes even owned RKO Studios, one of the big five film studios of Hollywood's golden era. Yes, there's no doubt that Hughes loved movies, maybe even as much as Warren Beatty. But of course, Hughes' true passion was aviation, and it was in that industry, as an engineer, pilot, and defense contractor, that Hughes really made his name, and his fortune. He set multiple world air speed records as a pilot, developed and built famous aircraft such as the H-1 Racer and the H-4 Hercules, better known as the Spruce Goose, acquired and expanded TWA, and formed the Hughes Aircraft Company, which not only developed planes, but would later go on to create missiles for the military and outer space exploration hardware for NASA. While Hughes' enduring legacy is often unfortunately overshadowed by his later years' eccentric behavior and reclusive lifestyle, largely a byproduct of his worsening obsessive-compulsive disorder, there's no doubt his impact on the world of flight earned him his Congressional Gold Medal and his spot in the National Aviation Hall of Fame. In fact, Hughes and aviation were so synonymous in the 30s and 40s that when a 90s major studio movie adaptation of a 30s set pulp tribute comic book about the world of aviation decided they needed to change the creator of the fictional hero's jetpack from Doc Savage, another famous fictional pulp character, to a real-life figure, there was really only one historical figure who made sense. And so, yet another well-known actor, Terry O'Quinn, would get his chance to portray Howard Hughes on screen, just as Warren Beatty would do 25 years later. And perhaps, in a different world, where Beatty's Dick Tracy and this film in question had both been bigger hits, they could have had a shared universe crossover, allowing Beatty as Tracy to meet O'Quinn as Hughes, since the same studio handled both pulp homage movies. The year is 1991, and only 1 year after Dick Tracy, Walt Disney Studios is ready to give another pulp-infused comic book adaptation a shot, and perhaps launch the next big action-adventure franchise with The Rocketeer. 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. Welcome once again to Failure to Franchise, the show dedicated to some of Hollywood's most infamous mistakes, missteps, and misfires. This is Trev.
Trev, prepare yourself for a shock. I'm the Potateer.
The pot of who?
Oh, for crying out loud. Haven't you read our reviews?
And now we both take a bow.
Yes.
The crowd applauds, yes.
And check the reviews, and now they are 1 star.
I was going to say, Chris, joke's on you. We don't have any reviews. So.
Well,
yeah.
Time to go.
maybe the super fans of today's movie will really already have appreciated our amazing dramatic recreation of one of the scenes from 1991's The Rocketeer, which is the second episode in our Pulp Frustration miniseries. As we said last time, a 2-month event looking at the run of films, or at least some of the run of films in the 90s, based on pulp heroes. As I said, this is 1991's The Rocketeer, another Disney movie, 2 in a row for us.
Yeah.
Chris, why don't you tell us a little bit about this one?
Of course. This one is directed by Joe Johnston. He's kind of a Spielberg-Lucas protege.
Yeah.
Most famous for Adventures of Young Indiana Jones, Jumanji, Jurassic Park 3, Captain America, and another F2F alum, Trev, The Wolfman, where we covered back when we did our Curse of the Dark Universe series. So go check that out. This is written by Danny Bilson and Paul DeMeo. They're most known for a classic Flash TV show, by the way, which I never even heard of. Trancers franchise, again, another one I'm not too familiar with. Some James Bond video games, and most recently, Da 5 Bloods. It is also written by William Deere, who is most famous for Harry and the Hendersons. This is also based off the 1982 graphic novel by Dave Stevens. The budget of the film ballooned up to $35 million. And worldwide, Trev, this made $46.7 million. So this was a major bomb, especially with the plans that Disney had for it. So that's why we're talking about it today.
For sure. And, the listeners might have heard that and just first thought to themselves, wait a minute, it was a 1991 movie and you said it was based on a 1982 comic book? Like, how pulp could this be? Because obviously a lot of the other, all the other characters we're looking at for this 2-month event are characters that were around for a very long time, right? Since the 30s or the 40s. And that's kind of what we think of with pulp characters. But the Rocketeer is very much a character set in the pulp world. It's an homage to the old pulps. It is Dave Stevens' loving tribute to the serials he grew up on and that kind of, adventure spirit pulp characters from his youth. So I would say this, you hadn't seen this. I know this is another first time watch for you. Without even seeing your thoughts on it, would you agree with me that this still easily fits into the pulp, kind of theme?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, without a doubt. Without a doubt. Yes.
Yeah.
And for people that are unfamiliar with the Rocketeer as an IP, as I am, well, we'll get to that, the reasons why, and maybe I kind of missed out on this. But this is a story that takes place in pre-World War II, L.A., and it's
1938,
around, 1938. It's revolves around our protagonist, Cliff Secord, a stunt pilot who discovers a mysterious rocket pack that allows him to fly. That's kind of the main adventure around Cliff and the Rocketeer.
Yeah, and the inspiration for it was, like I said, Dave Stevens, who was already, a fairly accomplished graphic novelist or, comic book artist at this point. He was kind of thinking back to, in his youth, there was we talked before in this podcast about movie serials. When you in the 30s and 40s, kids would go to the theater and they would watch these installments, these 15-minute chapters. They were basically TV shows, but shown in the theater. And he was thinking back to 2 of them, one called King of the Rocket Men and another called Commando Cody, both Republic Pictures serials, and both of them featuring a hero who wears a jetpack and has like a, stylized helmet. And so it's kind of like a, proto Iron Man essentially. And he was thinking back to that, and they've especially definitely the visual inspiration for the Rocketeer, but even like I said, him setting it in 38 and giving it that old retro nostalgic feel was him trying to feed back to the serials he loved as a young boy.
And what's crazy about this is that it didn't have too much of a run before immediately selling the film rights.
That's something that always I always forget about. Yeah, it's something I always forget, and then every time I kind of revisit the Rocketeer and then look back at it, I'm like, oh yeah, that's right. And that's something I definitely want to talk about in this episode, because I'm sure we do have some listeners who are unfamiliar with this movie and this character, and it is another comic book adaptation. And usually, especially nowadays, when you talk about comic book adaptations, they're always adapting characters that have been around for a long time or are part of a gigantic IP that, even if they're recent, they're, like Miss Marvel's a fairly recent character, but she's part of Marvel, and she feeds into a larger universe. It's pretty shocking to go back and realize that by the time this movie was made, there had only been 8 chapters of the Rocketeer comic book. And when we say chapters, these aren't even full issues. These were installments that were published in another comic. It was a backup feature in a comic called Star Slayer from Pacific Comics. So by the time you get to this like movie, there's not a lot of source material for the Rocketeer,
Right.
but Dave Stevens' artwork is pretty incredible, and there is just something. We'll talk, I'm sure, about the costume, but you can just see why anybody would look at it and probably right away start salivating about its movie potential. And in fact, David Stevens has said when he was doing the comic, he was already thinking, I bet this would make a good movie.
Absolutely. And that's why, the comic comes out in 1982 and Dave Stevens sells the film rights literally the next year. He sells it to Steve Miner, who's a producer of Die Hard and Predator 2. And then kind of the film sits for a little too long. Nothing happens, and the rights revert back to Dave Stevens. So he gets to meet with other writers, other producers, other studios, and he gets in touch with Danny Bilson and Paul DeMeo. Now, the reason why he likes these guys to take over the film is that every time he has one of these conversations about the Rocketeer, the pitch is making it contemporary. Yep. And like what we said earlier, this is one of those rare pulp heroes that was never really around during that pulpy time. It was created as a throwback. So when Dave Stevens hears this pitch that it's about pre-war mugs, I mean, right away, he's like, you guys are the guys. You guys get this character. You get Cliff. You get what I was going for. Let's get to work together. And what's so fascinating about this is that when they start to write the treatment and start to plan this, they actually plan it as a low-budget black and white film funded by independent investors. I found that very, very strange, especially when you got some sort of gold on your hands here. You have some sort of interesting IP, and it's quite a ballsy move to be like, you know what, we're just gonna reach out to like the GoFundMes of the past. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. Like it's like their first inkling wasn't to go to Disney. I found that very interesting.
It's interesting, but at the same time, you think like I said, this was based on the Commando Cody and Rocket Men serials. And so I get the temptation to say like, let's try and copy that as closely as possible, which might have been an interesting gimmick even at this point. And to be fair, again, without getting into our spoilers yet about how we feel about it, the bigger budget Disney approach obviously commercially didn't work for them. So it does make you wonder if they had gone that low budget black and white route, would it be, it's already a cult movie today, but would it be a bigger cult movie today? Because would it be like more of like a really strange oddity that came out at this time, or would it have failed even harder and be completely forgotten today? I don't know. I don't know the answer to that. I do think it's interesting. And there's a part of me that I don't dismiss that approach. And I think it would have been kind of cool if they'd actually gone through with that.
It's funny that you say it's either one or the other, right? But I feel like maybe even a bigger cult movie means it's bigger within cult communities. You know what I mean? Like there's even less popularity than there already is, but it is a fervent fan base. You know what I mean? Compared to now.
Yeah.
But they quickly abandon that idea. And I have to bring this up to you here because there's a couple changes that they make in their treatment before approaching these bigger studios. They decide to include it in Hollywood and a climactic battle with a Nazi Zeppelin. But also they changed the female protagonist, Cliff's love interest. This is something that I'm a little bit wishy-washy on. So they changed it from Betty to Jenny for reasons that you will explain to me.
Yeah, I mean, the reasons are very obvious when you start talking about it, because it was Dave Stevens in the comics. He made the Rocketeer's girlfriend, Betty Page, who's a real-life figure. Today, I think people still know the name Betty Page, but typically when they hear it, they just know it as like the Betty Page haircut, which is, of course, the haircut that she popularized, right? The straight bangs hanging down. But she was one of the first pinup models. She was a very, very famous pinup model in the 50s. And she actually, the reason I know a little bit about this is she did have kind of this big resurgence in popularity in the 90s. And some people pointed to saying maybe it was the Rocketeer comics and then it couldn't have been the movie, but especially the comics that kind of like maybe drew attention back to her. And that's what I wanted to ask you about. We talked about this a little bit before we started recording. I was wondering how much you knew about Betty Page, because I was, a young kid in the 90s, and I remember the whole like resurgence of Betty Page and how there was like a lot of like iconography of her coming back, and you could find like the paintings of her on t-shirts. I have a deck of Betty Page playing cards. There was just like a whole kind of Betty Page revival, which like ultimately ends up culminating in them even making that movie about her. I don't know if you know the movie, The Notorious Betty Page, which stars Gretchen Mol as her. So yeah, she's a very, very famous figure, but I just thought that's kind of, that's pretty ballsy of Dave Stevens to just be like, I like this woman so much that I'm just going to make this real person into the character in my comic.
Yeah.
I mean, it sort of makes sense because Betty Page, even though, she was a real person, she became a character to a certain sense, it's hard to describe. I'm sure you know what I'm saying.
Yeah,
she became such an icon that it's kind of like if you wrote Marilyn Monroe into a story, people wouldn't bat an eye, really. It worked in the comic, but I think they realized that with a movie, it'd be a little more tricky because you'd have to get her permission, which I around this point, I'm not sure she was very much like willing to be in the public eye anymore. So she probably wouldn't have given the permission anyways. But also you're just dealing with like, I don't know, the weirdness of having a real life figure. So yeah, they make that change. And it's probably a good change, I'd say.
Yeah. Yeah, I think so too. And especially because this property feels kind of like reality adjacent.
Yeah, that's the thing is the movie does have a lot of real life figures in it, including one who is a pretty like prominent character. So you could have got away with it, but I think we'll talk about this more obviously, but there's something different between the way they use the real life figures that are in the movie to having one and saying, well, she's the girlfriend of the hero.
Yeah,
I mean, it's totally, just like that's putting her in a completely different position than what she really was. And when we talk about the movie, also, I have read the original Dave Stevens comics, and I'm going to talk to you about the comparisons.
Okay.
And I even have more to say about this then. So I'll just tease that by saying I'm even beyond the legality of it and the trickiness of just the ethics. They made the right call making this change. Okay. I'll tell you why later. Yeah.
Sure. So Dave Stevens, Bilson, and DeMeo, and Deere, actually, he's still attached to direct it. They begin to pitch The Rocketeer in 1986 to major film studios. Walt Disney starts to get excited about it, but also a little bit wary because Batman is just around the corner. Dick Tracy's just around the corner. There's a lot going on, but nothing untested. And like what we talked about back in the Dick Tracy episode, the thing that really kicked so much of this off was Batman. But here in 1986, that stuff is just kind of getting off the ground. You know what I mean? Yeah. So it's still kind of like a big risk. So Disney is a little bit apprehensive, but they eventually accept. And the reason they do is because of this term. I love this term. They believed the film had toyetic potential.
Oh, yeah.
Which is like quintessential Disney, Yeah. So this had a huge appeal for merchandising. Spaceballs the flamethrower, Spaceballs the lunchbox. That's kind of just what this is about here. That's why they want to make the movie. They do. Well,
and the irony here, too, is that this is why we just mentioned how the comic hadn't been around very long and there was only like a few issues of it. That actually probably worked to its benefit in this case.
Right.
Because you said this was still a period where Hollywood was very gun shy about comic book movies because Batman hadn't happened yet. And so those floodgates, weren't back open because the prevailing memory of comic book movies at this point was the crash and burn of Superman 3 and 4.
Right.
So nobody was rushing to make a comic book movie, but Disney's end to look at this, they'd say, nobody even knows this is a comic. Nobody's heard of The Rocketeer. It's not a Marvel property. It's not a DC property. It's through a smaller publisher. We can just call it Disney's Rocketeer, and they'll think it's an original character. So I think they looked at it more like, we're making an adventure film. We're not making a superhero comic book movie.
That's a great point. I totally agree with that. That's great.
Yeah.
But they don't want to release it under Walt Disney Pictures. They realize that this treatment and this script is a little bit adult. I mean, again, the main heroine is based off a pinup model. They're getting a little bit nervous about its family-friendly content, so they actually want to release it under the studio's Touchstone Pictures label. And then, weirdly, at the last second, Disney studio chairman Jeffrey Katzenberg switches it to Walt Disney Pictures and demands a bunch of changes to the script. Dave Stevens has a quote here. Immediately, Betty and anything else adult went right out with the bathwater. They really tried to shoehorn it into a kiddie property so they could sell toys. All they really wanted at the end of the day was the name. And then that goes back to what Trev was talking about, right? They want to make this their own signature franchise, no IP. This is our Rocketeer.
Yeah, that's really interesting to me because I was trying to think, and I want to gauge your opinion on this, Chris. We just said this probably wasn't being looked at as a comic book movie. So I was trying to think, to their eyes, what would be the closest analogy? What would be the film property they were probably, comparing this to internally? And I would say it would have to be Indiana Jones.
Yes.
Right? It has that kind of vibe. And Indiana Jones was, PG or PG-13 at this point. And so it's surprising to me that they wanted to go so like kiddie with this and not lean more into, because, Indiana Jones certainly has some more adult themes to it. And it just surprised me that they weren't willing to be just a little bit more adult. Again, I'll talk about later what I think about that in the long run, in the end product. But just weird to me that they made that call.
I guess maybe, this is post Temple of Doom. So maybe they're getting a little gun shy because Temple of Doom, by most people's accounts, got, very, very dark and turned off people and turned off kids. And even Spielberg, I don't agree with him here, and me and you both don't agree with him, but over the years has been a little bit regretful about how dark he gets with that film. I think it's great and pretty ballsy, but maybe that's why, because again, this is 1986. That movie came out in 1984. There's got to be a little bit of gun shy there. That's probably how I would explain it.
Do you think in '89 when Indiana Jones and Last Crusade came out and did like gangbusters, they were all like, "Oh, oops!" We should have kept with the more adult tone.
Yes, definitely.
Why don't we have a hot blonde Nazi chick in our movie? No.
Yeah, 100%.
That's the weird thing too. Is just I don't think from what I read they ever dropped. Spoiler alert, folks, for the Rocketeer, the bad guys are Nazis.
We're going to be doing one thing and one thing only: killing Nazis.
Damn Nazis. Not surprising in a 1938 pre-World War II movie, right? But I never read that they dropped that element. So it's just also funny that Katzenberg was like, let's make this more kiddie. We'll keep the Nazis.
You say that, but this movie, this script had endless revisions.
Sure.
I guess over 5 years, Disney fired and rehired the writers 3 times. And there could be a bunch of drafts that the Nazis do not appear. So
that's true.
I feel like this one went through so much studio meddling and junk that I bet there was fucking 20 different versions of the Rocketeer.
And reading about that was so funny because it's just the typical Hollywood bullshit that we talk about so much in this show, that basically this show exists because of it. The idea that the original writers, they fired them and rehired them 3 times. And the writers even said, they kept trying to bring in other people. They'd write those scripts. Then they'd be like, or like this, would you guys want to come back and try again? And then it sounds like it was basically just one of those ultimate runarounds to basically get them back to the point where they more or less had started.
Yeah.
So just all this time wasted. This movie could have happened a lot sooner. Which I don't know. Again, you can't say whether that would have been to its benefit or not. But you just think of all the time wasted for no good reason. It sounds like,
dude, that leads perfectly into the design of the character and the constant tinkering to end up at the exact same starting place. Anyways, The Rocketeer original design has this extremely iconic helmet with a big fin on the back.
It's amazing, Art Deco looking design. Yeah,
it's awesome.
It's just, you see it right. That's what I mean. All you would need to see is one Dave Stevens drawing of the Rocketeer and be like, "Ooh, that's a movie." It's just perfect on the page.
And of course, Michael Eisner, CEO of Disney, president of Disney at this time, does not want that helmet. He wants a traditional NASA type helmet. And at this point, let's put a pin in this for a second. We have our director, Joe Johnston, being a fan of the comic book, also coming off the success of Honey, I Shrunk the Kids, his first
movie
feature.
debut.
And Joe Johnston actually, like I said before, was a Spielberg-Lucas protege. Well, he was that because he was a miniature VFX artist at ILM. So he knows special effects, he knows design, so they want him to lead this brand new adventure film. Yeah. Anyways,
and by the way, knowing what we know about Joe Johnston and his whole vibe from this film and many that follow, the fact that he was a fan of the comic book the least surprising news of all time.
Yeah, you're so right. You're so right. So then take the pin back out. Okay, we're back to the helmet. Eisner doesn't want the helmet, wants a NASA-styled helmet. Joe Johnston threatens to quit. And there's this big push and pull. There's a ton of different prototypes that are designed. A back and forth. I don't want this. I want that. Tweak this, tweak that. And guess what, Trev? Oh, we get the original design anyways.
Yep. Yeah, everything like down to like not just the helmet, but the costume, everything. He ends up looking exactly as he did on the page, which it just should have been a no-brainer from the very beginning. Yeah. You know?
And it's so funny because this movie does go over budget. Shockingly, I know you're thinking that, listeners. It goes over budget for a multitude of reasons, but Disney sees the dailies and they want to make this character such a toyetic production, so they approve the overages.
And it's so weird to me that they were, you read that they were so obsessed with the whole toyetic thing because, and now I'm granted, I was 10 or 11 when this movie came out, so I'm not going to pretend my memory of that time is amazing, but I don't remember there being a lot of Rocketeer toys and merchandising. Right. Our last episode, we looked at Dick Tracy, and I talked about how there was just Dick Tracy merchandise up the ass at that point. You couldn't, it was just everywhere. So much so that I was just recently at an antique mall, and guess what? You can still find a lot of that old Dick Tracy merchandise sitting around in a lot of antique malls. There's just so much of it. They went nuts with the merchandising and marketing on that movie. And I don't remember that being the case with the Rocketeer, which is strange because it does have an amazing design that they were right. I think the design lends itself to toys. So it's just, again, it's one of those things where I just feel like probably different people at the company were interested in this film for different reasons, and other people just didn't get it, and everybody had like different thoughts about it, because ultimately it sounds like Disney felt like, is this a Disney movie? Is it a Touchstone movie? Is it a kids movie? Is it an adult movie? Do we merchandise it? Do we not? It seems like it was really like a struggle to do that. And ultimately, as I said, to just ultimately come back around to making a movie that is, for more or less essentially Dave Stevens' original comic.
Well, and I think this movie evaded me, right? Like I've always known of the Rocketeer. Like I'm not dumb. Like I know it's around. I've never wanted to see it, and I think I go back to what you're, I guess, maybe alluding to is just the total cluster that was marketing on this film. What is this movie, right? Yeah. And I feel like from my perspective, I always thought this was just some big kiddie movie, I really did feel that way. Like I've seen some of the posters that Disney put out, and I've seen some clips here and there, and I just always thought it was just some dumb kids movie. And looking at the marketing here, they did endorsements with Pizza Hut, M&M's. They had posters, toys, trading cards, pins, patches, buttons, T-shirts, tons of children's clothing. And it's funny because there's a laundry list of stuff they did, including $19 million for TV ads, by the way. And even you, somebody that has at least somewhat of a memory of this era, feels like maybe even the Rocketeer evaded you. Yeah. You know what I mean? Yeah. Like that's what's so baffling.
I was definitely, I didn't see this in the theater, right? I saw Dick Tracy in the theater. Okay. I did not see the Rocketeer in the theater. I came back around to this either on video or probably more likely when it got to cable. So yeah, like it whatever they were doing missed even me. And look, in 91, I'm a dumb 10 or 11-year-old who wants to see all the big movies coming out, Sure. So something wasn't connecting. And you even go and like look into that, like with, I'm sure you saw it too, Chris, that the original poster is this amazing painted piece that really leans into the whole Art Deco aesthetic, where it's this like profile shot of the Rocketeer blasting off into the air, and it just looks like it's like beautiful, right? And at some point they dropped that and they made like a far more generic poster that has all the actors on it, and that's what ultimately becomes the real one sheet and the cover of all the video releases to this day. And it's like, oh man, look at this amazing painted piece you had. So I really think they couldn't figure it out. And honestly, to this day, I think it's a property that Disney is, I don't want to say embarrassed by, but they still don't know what they have with it. They still don't quite get it. Because I mean, even to the point where a few years ago, they released a 25th anniversary Blu-ray of it that had like no special features, right. And they advertise it that way. They're like 25th anniversary edition. And it's like, oh, what's on here? Oh, chapter stops and menus. Cool. They couldn't throw like anything on there. And it's just bizarre because, as we'll talk about later, they have revisited this franchise. They're thinking about maybe doing so again. We'll talk about that, but I think the Rocketeer is remains a big question mark for Disney. Of what is this? What do we have with this?
I mean, you're 100% right. They didn't know what was going on with it. They don't know what to do with it. And at the time, Disney wanted an A-list actor. So you're talking about these posters, right? I mean, at the time, they were looking at Kevin Costner, Bill Paxton, Emilio Estevez, Dennis Quaid, Johnny Depp,
Kurt Russell.
Kurt Russell. And these are all, Hollywood heavy hitters, and throwing them on the poster maybe would have helped his chances. But that doesn't line up with Dave Stevens and Joe Johnston's vision for the film and vision for Cliff Secord. They really fought Disney on this and really, really wanted an unknown. I understand why they did what they did. I understand the vision there. From the business perspective of the Walt Disney Company, I also understand their perspective. So it's a tough one. It's a tough one.
No, I did want to mention that because if we're right now talking about why, when I was a kid in 91, why did this movie escape me? Why did this movie bomb? Why did it not connect? Why was it not even the minor hit financially that Dick Tracy was? That does boil down to the star, I think. There's just no denying it. We're not talking about what we think of the performance yet, but I will say that this was a period. I was just alluding to this earlier, right? Comic book movies were pretty new. It was a new idea. You had Superman, you had a couple other huge failure ones, but in general, this was still the era of the movie stars, an era that I know you and I both bemoan losing. Where movie stars open movies, and ultimately, I will say, I think there's no doubt that the Rocketeer needed an A-list star in the lead role to get attention and to be a hit. It couldn't sell itself as the Rocketeer. Today, you can release, a Shazam movie, and it doesn't matter who's playing Shazam because people just know, oh, that's another comic book movie. You can have a movie like Guardians be, a lot of not movie stars yet. But that wasn't the case in 91. You needed a star. And beyond that, I will say also, I think the reason the movie has never come back around and got a bigger second life is because Billy Campbell never went on to be a star either.
Totally.
So it's like the kind of thing where if this had come out, he was a nobody and the movie bombed, but 4 years later, he had a huge breakthrough role and he became as big as a Kurt Russell or a Kevin Costner, then people would today go back and be like, oh, did you ever see that first movie he made, The Rocketeer? And it would have had a whole second life. But he never really, he's worked all the time up till now. And I'll mention some stuff too. But yeah, it's like a double whammy for them. He wasn't a star at the time, and he never became the star the movie needed to be rediscovered.
Yeah. I think that's a perfect transition to just talking about the movie proper.
Let's do it.
To some, it was the fulfillment of a dream. To others, it was an instrument of destruction. A creation that could change the course of history.
It was stolen from my factory.
Where's the package?
This is the FBI!
What do we tell the president?
Tell me exactly why this merchandise is so important to the feds.
It's a rocket.
A rocket?
What? What's the matter?
I don't know. There's something under the seat.
Oh, my. What do we got here?
What are you supposed to do? Is it a bomb or something?
No. I wouldn't touch that if I were you.
How do I look?
Like a hood ornament.
Stand clear.
What was that? A flying man!
Big gopher. Are you trying to kill yourself? I like it. Uh-oh, we got company.
You steer, I'll push. Or what?
I will not rocket Eddie. Not next week, not tomorrow. Now.
Keep your eyes open for this dame. Jenny's in trouble.
They're working for a Nazi agent.
With an army equipped with these, you could rule the world.
You touch one hair on her head, I swear I'll...
Shoot him! We've got the girl. The rocket will come to us. I love her, Peeve. Does she know that?
She's gonna find out.
Let him have it!
Hand over the rocket!
Rocketeer.
Go get him, kid.
In 1938 Los Angeles, pilot Cliff Secord crashes his plane after being hit in the air during a shootout between gangsters and FBI agents. In the aftermath of the crash, Cliff and his best friend Peavy find a mysterious package hidden by one of the gangsters. In this package lies a rocket pack that allows a man to fly. Meanwhile, Cliff's beloved girlfriend and aspiring actress, Jenny Blake, succeeds in getting a small part in a movie starring the great Neville Sinclair. During a flight exhibition, there's an accident in which Cliff has to strap on the rocket pack and save a man. The newspapers run with the story of the Rocketeer, the mysterious flying man. With his picture on the front page of every newspaper in town, Cliff is chased by the FBI, working for engineer Howard Hughes, and gangsters, working for actor Neville Sinclair, all of whom want their hands on this great new technology.
That is indeed The Rocketeer. Chris, we said this last time, you have not seen any of our Pulp Frustration movies.
Yes.
These are first-time watches for you all. So why don't you share your thoughts as a first-time watch of The Rocketeer, a movie you just said that you had kind of avoided because you always thought it was just kind of kiddie nonsense. So
Yep.
Was it that or what? How'd you feel?
This is interesting. I might even say this is a failure to franchise, one of the most unique experiences of me watching a film, because this is a legit Walt Disney classic.
Mm-hmm.
And this is a real movie, Trev. This is a movie with heart, without a cynical bone in its body. There's hopefulness to this film. It's old-fashioned. It's unlike modern blockbusters today. It is a thing of the past that I think me and you both wish was still around in the public consciousness. It's about bravery, heroism. It inspires joy. It's smart as hell. The script is top-notch. This is a very, very well-made Hollywood movie. And I loved it. I loved every minute of it. And truly, I sat back, right in the opening with James Horner's score and the doors moving open and the title fading away, and it just feels so classic. I feel like I'm watching I'm watching a real movie. I hate to sound like so lame about it, but this Disney marketing did not do this movie any favors. Like I said, I've gone my whole life thinking that this was just some dumb kiddie movie that was made to sell toys. And yes, maybe Disney wanted it to be made to sell some toys, but there's some real vision behind it. And I'll tell you, this is near the top of my failure to franchise movies. I really, it's in the top bunch for sure. Yeah, I think it's awesome. I think it's great.
Yeah, so revisiting it, this is a movie I'd seen in the past, more than once, but it had been a while. And revisiting it, I'll tell you what, Chris, I think you'll know exactly what I mean when I say this. You and I have been pretty down lately on the superhero genre.
Correct.
Feeling very overwhelmed by it, and just not just the amount of content, but just also how I think it's like undeniably gotten lazier and worse. Talking about the MCU and just the recent DC efforts, and even on the TV end, all this stuff is just starting to become really samey and interchangeable and cynical, and you can tell no one's really trying. And then I watched The Rocketeer, and I'll just say, I needed this.
Yeah.
Like, I needed this movie in my life so bad right now, because it rekindled for me, oh yeah, this is what I love about these kind of movies, and this is what this kind of movie can do to you as an audience member, the kind of emotions it can stir. Because this movie, as you said, this is completely earnest, it's heartwarming, it's charming, it is like one of our best superhero movies.
Yeah, it's totally unpretentious.
Yeah, unpretentious. It's not like winking at the audience. No. It's they don't have to make dumb jokes. It's funny. It's got a very funny script. The characters are funny, but it's not the dumb kind of Marvel humor which undercuts the seriousness of what's happening in the moment. Yeah. It's more just the humor comes from the situations the characters find themselves in. They don't have to like wink at the audience and be like, we know this is dumb, right? The characters don't think they're in a dumb movie. They're just in The Rocketeer, and it's so like, I would say straight-faced, but like I said, it has a sense of humor, it has a lightness to it, but it's taking itself seriously. And that's what I loved. And you said it's so heartwarming. And yeah, it's just is it a little talky? Yeah, it could be trimmed down a little bit, right? It's got some pacing issues, I'd say. And it's also, and this is, I know that this is an unfair criticism to a certain degree. It is a movie that was unfortunately probably on a special effects level, probably about 5 or 10 years before it should have been to really deliver on the full potential of itself. But putting all that aside, just taking it at face value and the characters and the adventure story and the sense of adventurism and heroism, a real, likable, strong hero. It just warms my little comic book loving heart to see a movie like this and compare it to the bullshit we're getting from the studios today.
Yeah, I agree with you. I've had me and you, like you said, we've been down in the dumps about, the state of Hollywood, and I'm not gonna lie, just in my personal life, the last week has been just a kind of like a crummy week, one of those like down in the dumps types of weeks, right? Mm-hmm. And the Rocketeer really broke through. It made me smile, it made me laugh, it made me remember why I like going to the movies, and I kind of, it's sad that this movie has been so, it's like that like ugly stepchild, that like that Disney owns. And in a world where I've seen clips of Ant-Man 3 and then watching this, where there's something special about watching real planes, Trev. I don't know if Top Gun Maverick taught us all that again, finally, all these years later. But seeing things done for real, in camera, out on location, with real actors, with real charm, real likability, actual growth, character arcs. What else? Oh, a genuine humor, love between each other. It's funny how that makes for a good movie.
And, one thing I will say, Chris, and I know this is what I can speak to more than you, so I'll just get this out of the way now and I'll talk more about it as we go through the review. But here's the thing, too. It's way better than the graphic novel. So I know we'll talk about, no offense to Dave Stevens, who I love Dave Stevens' art. He's unfortunately, Dave Stevens has passed away, but man, he was an incredible artist and he created this amazing character in this amazing world. I thank him for the Rocketeer, and I like his Rocketeer issues. Don't get me wrong. I've read them. I enjoy them. But he had that comment about how once Disney took over, all the adult stuff went out the window and they decided to kiddie it up. Here's the thing, Chris. I didn't want to give this away too much earlier, but Disney was right. Dropping the adult stuff was actually a huge benefit to this. When you read the comic does feel too adult for what it should be. The Betty Page stuff, especially. All the Betty Page illustrations in the movie. Betty Page was a kind of a sex pot pinup model. And he draws her that way. She's very often topless. He does the thing where there's always something covering the nipples, but she's topless, and it's very much, her storyline is very much, she is a pinup model, and this agent has taken her under his wing, and he wants to take her to Hollywood, and it's clear he's ultimately trying to sleep with her. And so that's the whole storyline. It's very skeevy. It's very gross. And the other crazy thing is, in the comic, Cliff Secord, the Rocketeer, he's a huge jerk. He's not very likable in the comic. He spends the entire comic complaining about how Betty is mean to him and doesn't want anything to do with him because she has this career. And, they allude to that here, but never in a way that makes Cliff an asshole. And I don't find him likable at all in the comic. And I think the movie is such an improvement over the graphic novel. I just wanted to kind of say that. And I'll talk about some other changes they had to make. But yeah, the movie is, to me, the better version of the Rocketeer.
That really surprises me, by the way. Especially the characterization of Cliff. Because I have a quote here from Dave Stevens. He says he acknowledges he was satisfied with 70% of the film and highly praised Joe Johnston's direction. The overall spirit and sweetness of the series is still there intact. We lost some good character stuff in editing for time, but the tone of it is still what I was trying to project in the comic pages. I also thought Joe's casting choices were excellent. To his credit, Joe did not fill out the cast with a bunch of Beverly Hills 90210 Barbie and Ken type kids. That's a funny quote to hear, though, after what you've just told me about the original source material.
I mean, there is that thing where, look, as someone who's written stories, writers have the hardest time seeing the reality of their work. There's a level of detachment. And maybe he thinks his comic is a lot more sweet and, not as adult as it is. I don't know. Or maybe even in his head after seeing the movie, I'm sure even for someone like him, because he was very involved with the movie. He was on set like every day. He gave them all of his sketchbooks. Like, he was really helpful with like the production design and everything. So I bet even over time, the movie and the comic kind of got muddled in his head to a certain degree. And he's just like, yeah, that's what I was always trying to do. That's what was on the page, right? It's like, well, no, not exactly. The book is much darker. It's more violent. The characters are more shitty to each other. It's not just, I'm not saying, look, don't get me wrong. I'm not saying it's like a Zack Snyder movie reading the comic or anything. Of course. It's not that. It's just, it's not as wholesome as the movie is. And what he says about, the look of it, personality, one thing, but Billy Campbell as Cliff Secord does look exactly like his drawings of Cliff Secord. Like, it really does look like, this is like what's the Last Action Hero is not what I'm looking for, but it really does look like the character walked off the page. Like, it's pretty incredible. Yeah, you can see why they fought for Billy Campbell. Let's
talk about Billy Campbell then, because like I am pretty shocked, or I mean maybe it's because the film didn't take off, but he's he had a long career. He's a working actor. He's in a fucking million things, but he is so good in this. Mm-hmm. He has this boyish charm to him, but he's still handsome.
Jenny, prepare yourself for a shock. I'm the Rocketeer.
The Rock of who?
Oh, for crying out loud. Haven't you read the papers?
No, I've been working all day.
But look.
You totally buy that he can get a girl like Jennifer Connelly, who we haven't even talked about yet, which we will talk about. But he's like the perfect level of clumsy that makes him sweet. It's kind of the way that, when you're watching, you talked about Indiana Jones, and I was thinking about Indiana Jones a lot during this. And, Indy is a man's man tough guy for the most part, but also he's a sweet history professor, and it's like, he's kind of a buffoon at times. And that's what's so fun. We've talked in the past before on certain episodes that we live in an era where adventure and action stars can't get hurt. They can't make mistakes. They can't lose fights. They can't have scratches on their face. I'm looking at you, The Rock. But in this movie, Cliff is kind of a dum-dum sometimes, but I think, but he's not obnoxiously dumb. I don't think he's stupid, because they do enough in the movie to show that he is at least clever. He has wits between him and his best friend Peavy, played by Alan Arkin. They solve problems together. Like when they find the rocket pack for the first time, and instead of strapping it on his back like an idiot, they actually go steal a statue first. And then they put it on the statue, and then they stake the statue into the ground because they're working out the problem. They realize that this is dangerous, so they're not going to test it on themselves. And I think there's little bits like that make them smarter than the average bear, but also allowed to be clumsy, because that's human nature, right? You're allowed to be clumsy in human nature. That's
the key to Cliff Secord and why he's a great character in this. Because I'm going to second what you said. I think this is an awesome performance from Billy Campbell. Awesome, and you do watch it, and you do watch it and think like, how did this guy not become a star? Mm-hmm. Especially since, Chris, if you can allow me a brief moment here. Of course, we know that Billy Campbell was the runner-up for the role of Commander William Riker on Star Trek: The Next Generation.
Oh, here we go.
Almost got that part.
Cue the music.
His consolation prize was that he did go on to play a guest character on Next Generation, the outrageous Akona, a character he has recently reprised on Star Trek Prodigy. Anyways, that's one of my Star Trek moments here. But he's so good in this, and the key, you just hit on it, is he's not dumb, but he's a bumbling hero.
Yes.
And he's a bumbling hero all the way to the end, and that's what I love, because we know the trajectory, we know the arc by now. It is this, for the most part, the first 2/3 of this movie follow the fairly standard superhero origin. Character either gets their powers or finds the thing that gives them powers. We watch them test it, and their first go out is like kind of rough, right? They make some mistakes, they screw up. And then suddenly every superhero movie, or most of them, have the thing where after that, they suddenly just go like, well, I made all my mistakes in that first mission, and now I'm a badass. And now I know exactly what I'm doing. But Cliff never has that moment.
No.
Cliff is still bumbling at the end in the last action sequence. In the big finale, he's still, a lot of stuff is just, he's accidentally doing the right thing. He's getting by on luck a lot. You know, he's still making mistakes. And I love that because it doesn't mean he's not heroic. What makes him heroic is not the fact that he's perfect at what he does. It's that even though he's clumsy, even though he's bumbling, and even though he doesn't always know what to do in every situation, he's always willing to strap on that helmet and that rocket pack and fly off to save the day.
Yep.
When there's a dangerous situation, he will try to save people. He will try to do the right thing. That's what makes him a hero. So I love that he's like bumbling. And if we had gotten sequels, I would have loved if they had just kept that going. You don't need him to become like the badass Rocketeer. You just need him to be willing to be heroic. And and he's just so likable and so like charming. It's just and handsome as hell. Like he's pretty much the complete package. It's shocking to me that, you know, like I said, he's had a fine career. I'm not gonna, you know, mourn his career or anything because he's especially on TV. He's been a really prolific TV actor. But every time I see him in something, I'm like, oh yeah, Billy Campbell, the Rocketeer, he's awesome. I wish he was doing a little better for himself.
Do you think a movie like this and his performance just came a little too soon? You know, Joe Johnston replicates this film quite a bit thematically and even in the protagonist and in a lot of ways with Captain America, the First Avenger. Of course, we have to mention that right now, especially because we've talked about the MCU a little bit right now in the year 2023. But Phase 1 of the MCU was a testing ground. It was learning as they went. You know what I mean? And the through line between the Rocketeer and even Iron Man 1, honestly, Iron Man 1 and Captain America, the First Avenger, put them together, you got the Rocketeer. And I think that's a reason why that Phase 1 is so special, is because, again, you're seeing these characters played so earnestly and so charming and so likable, but are also screwing up, right? Mm-hmm. They're not unkillable heroes at this point. Especially with Captain America. Like, I love the First Avenger. I know you do too, but like the First Avenger to me is like, I've revisited that one so many times now, and it impresses me more and more with every rewatch. Mm-hmm. That movie's so fucking good, and it relies so heavily on your main character, right, of Cap, and he's got that sense of, yes, he will do anything. He'll throw himself on a grenade, literally. And you buy it. And I think that's kind of the message of this movie here with Rocketeer. Like, Cliff will get in harm's way. He'll stare Nazis in the face and tell them that they're wrong. He's just such an all-around big-time American hero. You know what I mean? Like, that's why it's so... It is, like, I'm so baffled. Even the way I'm talking about it now, I'm so happy I watched this movie and I loved it so much. But yet I'm in mourning for this film.
No, but I
mean?
I think you're right in that. And certainly, one of the strikes against this film at the time, and we should say this was well reviewed. You know, it was 2 thumbs up from Siskel and Ebert. Overall, I think the reviews were fairly positive.
Sure.
But for a general audience, I do think the earnestness and how much it wears its heart on its sleeve, that was starting to fall a little out of fashion, particularly in a post-'89 Batman world. You know, that was a moment where, people who were into comic books, the 90s is the era of edgy comic books, and like the bad boy. And then you see the 89 Batman and everyone's like, ooh, comic book movies should be like serious and dark now. And they weren't looking for something like the Rocketeer. And so it's a little bit ahead of its time in that matter. It might always be out of time, really, to this point.
Yeah.
But you asked if, like, in terms of Billy Campbell's career, going back to something I said earlier when I said the movie needed a bigger star to be a hit, and he never became a star afterwards for it to be rediscovered. I mean, the sad truth is, because this was a movie that came out during the movie star era, I think that's why he never became a star, is because this was his first huge lead role in a movie. This was basically his debut film after he'd done a little TV stuff. He had a recurring role in Dynasty, I know, but this was his big coming out moment as a movie star, right. And the movie bombed. And if it's true that it was the movie star era, then that meant that if you were the lead, whether you're a movie star or not, you were going to bear a large part of the responsibility for the movie's performance. And I think the failure of this movie, studios were probably very gun shy. I mean, because, like, to me, really, I could go look at his filmography and bring it up, but even for me, the only other thing I have a memory of him being in shortly after this was he plays Quincy in Bram Stoker's Dracula. Right. Which is, like, not a huge part. So he goes from being the lead of the Rocketeer to being, like, the eighth lead of Bram Stoker's Dracula, and it's like he never had another huge lead role in Hollywood. And I think that's unfortunate because he probably gets blamed for this.
Yeah, definitely.
Which is unfair, obviously, but that's the way. Hollywood never said they were fair.
No. I guess that leads to his love interest, Jenny, played by Jennifer Connelly, who's kind of having a moment here being in Top Gun Maverick last year. But Jennifer Connelly, I think we've said it in the past before, but an all-time crush for both of us. And she is stunning, is maybe the word. And she's so good. And she fits this 1930s pre-World War II look perfectly. She looks just ripped out of that era. So mind you, everybody does. Let's be honest. The production design is amazing, but I think she especially, I don't doubt that at all, and I especially don't doubt their chemistry. I guess they started dating during the movie, and it shows on screen. Those two are perfect for each other.
Yeah, no, like I said, this is definitely, it's another thing where it just proves that the movie evaded me in a way it shouldn't have, because definitely a crush of mine around this time. And even this came out the same year as Career Opportunities, which is a movie that I've revisited recently, and it was not as good as I remember it being from when I was a kid. It's actually, I don't think it's that great of a film, but the image of her on the coin-operated horse ride that is a famous gift to this day is emblazoned in my mind. and this is following also in 1990. She's in Dennis Hopper's The Hot Spot, which I don't know if you know that film, Chris. It's a modern film noir starring Don Johnson that Dennis Hopper made. Okay. One of the just absolute sexiest movies of the 90s, and it was that's one of her first real adult kind of sexy roles. So, she obviously does Labyrinth in 86, then The Hot Spot in 90. So now she's kind of shown both levels, right? Where she could be the young innocent, but she can also still have a level of somewhat, still adult sensuality to her. Yeah. And I just really love, and this is what I mean, changing Betty Page to Jenny Blake is definitely one of the best changes they made, because I love that Jenny is played so pure and innocent and is not the kind of more upfront sex pot that Betty Page is in the comic. And yeah, you said she just looks perfect for this era, and you care about her. That's the thing. There's something about Jennifer Connelly where you're just always immediately on her side. You root for her. You don't want to see anything bad happen to her. You want to protect her. I know that probably sounds really sexist and shitty, but watch a Jennifer Connelly movie, you'll know what I mean. It's just you do. You feel like Cliff Secord. You're just I gotta take care of her. I just really want the best for her.
That's why I think a movie like Requiem for a Dream is so visceral, and it just gets you in the gut, right? Because you're oh my God, they're doing this to Jennifer Connelly. No, please don't do that. And but I don't think it sounds sexist. I think what you're getting at is that there is a purity to her, especially in this film, but it's not like she doesn't get what she looks like. Okay, there's still a certain. There's a scene in here, I don't want to spoil it yet, but there's a scene with her and the villain of the film, and she does use her sex appeal and her ability to charm the pants off a guy, pun unintended, by the way, to get out of a situation. And I think it's expertly handled. I think she plays it really well. I think it's on her own terms, and it leads to a great reveal. So I think there is a, like you said, purity to Jennifer Connelly, but there's also just a, she's her own individual completely. You know, I don't think that she ever really needs no man. You know what I mean?
No, that's the thing, is because the movie does, she ultimately falls into damsel in distress, but the way Jennifer Connelly plays it, she never feels like a damsel in distress. The movie does its perfunctory, yes, the Rocketeer will have to go save his girl, but she's not as aggravating of a damsel in distress as we often see in this genre, because you always feel like, given enough time, she could probably find her way back out of this. She comes close, very much, and she knows how to handle herself too, because she has hung around with Cliff Secord and all his friends, and I want to talk about the friends too, but yeah, she's very capable in this world, even though she also exists in another part of the world that they are all kind of baffled by. They look at her they look at all the Hollywood stuff like highfalutin and whatever, but she's like Blade. She can walk in both worlds.
Yeah, and she's not screaming on bridges for all 3 Spider-Man movies. You know what I mean? Like she's not Kirsten Dunst's Mary Jane at all. She's very capable. That was the word I was looking for. You said it, so thank you.
Well, we mentioned the villain. Should we talk about Should we talk about the villain? Because this is a name we haven't even brought up yet, and we gotta talk about this performance.
Yes, one of two villains, let's say. So first, let's get him out of the way. Let's talk about gangster Eddie Valentine, who was played by Joe Pesci. No, actually, it was written for Joe Pesci, but I love when a failure to franchise moment happens, but we're looking at two Paul Sorvino movies in a row, Dick Tracy and Rocketeer, but Paul Sorvino, a Hollywood great, always love that guy, great character
Of course,
actor.
as I mentioned last time, best known for his role as Nikolai Roshevko, Worf's father on Star Trek The Next Generation.
Yes, correct.
No, pretty amazing that in 1990, he makes Dick Tracy and Goodfellas, and he says, you know what? That wasn't enough mobsters for me. I'm going to play one more mobster next year in The Rocketeer.
Yeah. And he's great. Always love him. But he is kind of
he's awesome in this too.
Oh, big time. He's the hired muscle to the main villain of the film, Neville Sinclair, played by none other than James Bond himself, Timothy Dalton.
Yeah. And he was James Bond at this point too. Yeah. That's the crazy thing. You know, you think like, so Neville Sinclair, the character, loosely based on, well, I don't even know what's that loosely based on. He's Errol Flynn. Let's face it.
Oh, yeah.
There's another thing where, why did they not just call him Errol Flynn, since there are other real life characters in this? You know, like he takes Jenny to a party and W.C. Fields is there. There's another very famous historical figure that we'll talk about in a moment. So it's like, why not just make him Errol Flynn? Oh, it reveals he's a Nazi.
Yeah.
And that's actually based on an old rumor that Errol Flynn was a Nazi that was ultimately debunked, I believe. But that's where Dave Stevens took the inspiration from. But Neville Sinclair, very much an Errol Flynn figure, which is just right up Timothy Dalton's like alley. And yeah, this was 91. He was still James Bond. He had done The Living Daylights in 87 and License to Kill in 89. And when this comes out, I think there's still a question, is he going to make his third? As we know, he ultimately doesn't. But he still would have been Bond in the public consciousness. And for him to say, you know, I'm going to play like a Nazi bad guy while I'm waiting to see if I make my third Bond, more power to him. I think we said this last time we talked about Timothy Dalton. We talked about him in our Flash Gordon episode. He is an actor that I've just come to love more and more in his post-Bond career, you know? And the more I've gone back and looked at his old stuff and been like, oh, you know, those two Bond, I like License to Kill. I'm not huge on Living Daylights, but, you know, I was young and he was definitely, the scuttlebutt around him was that he was kind of a failed Bond. Now, in retrospect, I think that's completely unfair. And you look at that performance and go, ooh, he was actually really good as Bond. But I've also been able to put that like what I was being told about him out of mind and just look at his performances and go, oh man, Timothy Dalton kicks ass. Because he's just got that old Hollywood vibe to him. That's why he's perfect for this. Okay. He feels like the modern Errol Flynn.
Yeah, we talked about him in depth during our Success to Series episode about the James Bond franchise and how he was ahead of his time. You know, he was Daniel Craig before Daniel Craig. And the world wasn't ready for Timothy Dalton yet as Bond. And I think what I love him so much in, like you said, post-Bond career, he relishes in the roles he takes. He's chewing scenery at every instance, and especially when he's a villain. And we said that he is revealed to be a Nazi, and that was what I was alluding to before, where Jenny needs to use her sex appeal to get away from him, and then it turns out that he's a Nazi. That ups the threat so significantly for the film that, and it was something I didn't know, by the way. So I was like, holy shit, he's an actual Nazi. Like, I knew he was a bad guy, but to be an actual legit, like, Nazi spy did surprise me.
Everything about you is a lie.
It wasn't lies, Jenny. It was acting.
Neville Sinclair is such a superficial character. He's so vain. He uses his own lines from his own films to seduce women. He's such a prick. And Dalton relishes in it, right? And it just leads to him being like the ultimate liar scumbag as a Nazi. And he's so good at it. He even does a little bit with his accent. He starts to do a little bit more of like a German accent. Like, it doesn't sound great, but it's like it works in this pulpy film we're watching. Every time Dalton is on screen, it's fantastic. He's the actor you look at. He's the guy that you're interested in. And, you know, a hero is only as good as his villain a lot of times, and I think this one is like a perfect match with boyish charm, innocent, clumsy Billy Campbell, and then ruthless, you know, vain, liar, but also charming in that, like, you know, skeezy way, Dalton. So I think it really, really works with each other.
Yeah, and once the whole like villain turn is revealed, and especially at the end when the whole Nazi thing is revealed, he really starts like amping up the villainy. He has to be so like despicable and unlikable that you buy the turn of Eddie Valentine, Paul Sorvino's character, and it works so well. I think that's maybe in a movie full of great moments, that moment where it's revealed that he's a Nazi and Eddie Valentine turns on him and says like,
I may not make an honest buck, but I'm 100% American. And I don't work for no two-bit Nazi.
and the great moment where the mobsters and the FBI start working together to take down his Nazi soldiers. Oh, so good. And based on like a little bit of reality too. Like that is true that the organized crime back in the 30s and 40s hated the Nazis because, a lot of them, there was a lot of Jewish people involved in the organized crime and just, a lot of them had come over from Europe and they did not cater to fascism. So that's based in reality. And then also, I just quick aside to that, we were talking about Cliff Secord earlier and like what makes him such a great hero. And you were talking about the screenplay. I love that one of the ways they tell us that Cliff Secord is like our hero and a good guy is that he's one of the only people in 1938 who's like on to Hitler.
Yeah.
When he takes Jenny to the movies and they're showing the newsreel, and it should be remembered that in 38, the world did not yet know what a monster Hitler was. And the Nazis were engaging in this like worldwide goodwill tour. And I like that Cliff Secord sees that. He's instantly like, oh, screw that guy. He's a fascist. And it's like, oh, okay, that's just a great shorthand to tell you this guy knows what's up.
Remember, there was a time in history, Trev, that Nazis were unquestionably bad.
Yeah, I know. Wasn't it nice?
Yeah, a bygone era. Era. But yeah, no, mobsters fighting alongside FBI agents to kill Nazis is totally my jam. So,
yeah, it's great.
And I love a Tommy gun shootout, just like the Dick Tracy ending. This was great, and it addressed something for me, again, on the script level, that when you find out that Neville Sinclair is a Nazi, you do think back, being like, okay, these gangsters are working for him. Like, do they know that? Like, that would be weird if they know that. And it is such a cool moment when Valentine knows it, and just right away, no questions asked, I'm on America's side. Super cool. Super cool. Speaking of expert-level script writing, this is like a perfect setup and payoff movie. I've spoken about that a lot in other episodes, but I love my foreshadowing. I love my setups and payoffs, and this script is beautiful for that. Even the smallest amount of stuff, like the first scene you meet Cliff, and he puts his chewed gum as a good luck charm on the rudder of his plane, and then Peavy being like, don't wreck the paint, and he takes it off, right, and then he's damaged the rocket pack, and then Peavy's like, oh, I know what's good. Put that chewed gum onto your rocket pack, and it kind of fixes it. And then it gets to the end, and it's like Cliff takes off the piece of gum because he knows it's going to explode. And it's like this little personality trait has become a through line for the big hero moment.
Yeah, the fact that the gum keeps coming back is awesome.
Yeah. And it's so simple. It's so simple, and it's a testament to great script writing, honestly.
Well, since you mentioned Peavy, should we just keep going down the line of awesome actors and great performances? Because I love Alan Arkin. Oh, yeah. Alan Arkin is also like one of those actors who, it's not like I'm never like, let's rush out to see the next Alan Arkin movie, But then I think back and it's like, man, every time Alan Arkin is in something, I love him. He kills it, and that's true in this too. He's just he's so likable as Peavy, which is like Cliff's mentor and best friend. They live together. But he's exactly what that role needs, because he has that kind of like weathered, tired frustration of Cliff Secord, but that you can tell is all about love, right? He loves Cliff. He's just like constantly annoyed by how arrogant Cliff can be sometimes and how dumb Cliff can be. But he sells that so well without ever being angry or without becoming like a cliche yelling type mentor.
Yeah.
And he's funny. Like Alan Arkin is just naturally funny. That's the best usage of Alan Arkin is usually in a supporting character that just can nail some zingers. He's great in this as always.
Yeah. And then we have Howard Hughes in the film too, played by Terry O'Quinn. John Locke himself.
Yeah. Well, best known as Admiral Pressman in the Pegasus episode of Star Trek The Next Generation.
Yes. I edit this podcast, Trev, and I'm going to edit all of this out.
Okay. No, obviously you and I love Terry O'Quinn because of John Locke. I mean, no doubt about it. I mean, even by the time this came out, he was also known. He'd been around for a while. Have you ever seen the Stepfather movies, Chris?
I have not. Again,
Okay.
Trev likes to give me some Halloween films and horror films to watch every year, and The Stepfather has been on the edge or precipice of me watching every year. So
Yeah.
I'm going to watch the remake first.
Oh, boy. Stepfather and Stepfather 2, you can ignore any other Stepfather film, because those are the only two with Terry Quinn. But yeah, pretty cool. So this is a big change from the comic. In the comic, the Rocket Pack was actually made by another pulp hero. So that's something kind of interesting about the comic, is, as we said, Dave Stevens was creating a new pulp hero and trying to like retroactively put him back in like the time of the pulps, and say like, this was always a 30s hero. I'm just like creating him now. And he interacts with a lot of other, by that point, public domain and well-known pulp heroes. So in the comic, the Rocket Pack was designed by Doc Savage. I don't know if that's a name that means anything to you. That's another like very famous pulp hero. There's a Doc Savage movie that maybe someday we will get to. But that's who designed the Rocket Pack in the comic, and some of Doc Savage's like associates come looking for it. And even in the second storyline that Dave Stevens did, the Rocketeer ends up working with the Shadow, which is the next movie we'll be doing. Interesting, huh? But they decided, obviously, they weren't going to put other pulp characters into this, because that would require getting other IPs, and the idea of shared universes wasn't a thing yet. Man, if only they had known, they probably could have done that. Today they would salivate at the idea of having Doc Savage show up in the Rocketeer movie. But really wise decision to say, well, who would probably have designed a rocket pack in 1938? And of course, it would be Howard Hughes. One of our most famous aviators, and Terry O'Quinn. Always awesome, but he's really good in this as Howard Hughes. He nails the voice. It's not the biggest part in the film, but it's memorable. I've always remembered him in this as Howard Hughes, because I just think he kind of nails it.
I've been meaning to ask you, what was it like strapping that thing to your back and flying like a bat out of hell?
It was the closest I'll ever get to heaven, Mr. Hughes.
Yeah, just instantly iconic as a legendary person of historical relevance.
And I like to. I mean, it's partly why I love The Aviator, which is actually, that's my favorite Leonardo DiCaprio performance of all time. And I love when people are reminded that Howard Hughes was more than those last few months or years of his life. Right. I think it's a shame that one of the larger like pop cultural memories of Howard Hughes is, that's that crazy guy who peed in jars and used tissue boxes as shoes, right? And they found him emaciated with super long fingernails. And it's like, yeah, he was, but before that, he was this super handsome, rich, famous aviator, made like movies and all that stuff, dated all these famous actresses. And I think I love when movies can remind us of that era of Howard Hughes, and not even, this doesn't even hint at like what's to come later,
Now he's just the inspiration to Howard Stark.
Yeah.
So
that's true. Yeah.
Another through line to the first Avenger. So there you go. Can we talk a little bit about the special effects here?
Sure. I
know you mentioned that the special effects maybe were ahead of its time, but also needed a few more years to catch up to the times. I sense that. I guess you kind of got to put your mind into 1991 when you're watching it. And other than maybe just a few, especially green screen things, the special effects hold up quite well, I thought.
Yeah.
But the flying scenes are pretty incredible when you look at the behind the scenes. They actually built these big miniatures of the Rocketeer to different scales. And again, going back to Joe Johnston and his background, he was an ILM miniature guy.
A miniature model of the Rocketeer was constructed in order to perform these gravity-defying stunts. Here's ILM's Gene Bolte.
They couldn't get all the shots of the flying that they had to get with stuntmen. Some of them had to be done in miniature. What they did was, first of all, take a sculpt of the chap wearing all of his clothes and his rocket pack. And I had to recreate his clothing scaled down, which is actually a fun job, because you really have to try and get that right. In order to make his leather jacket, I came up with thin latex sheets that I made up so that his jacket had a lot of stretch in it, but got all those beautiful little wrinkles in it when he bends here and all that. And if you don't get that scale right, you won't know maybe what's wrong when you see it on the screen, but it just won't click. It won't work out.
An animation technique called stop motion was used to give movement to the miniature Rocketeer.
We go over the storyboards with the effects director, who is Ken Ralston. We will talk to the director, Joe Johnson. We will try to get an idea from these two guys as to what they actually want the Rocketeer to do in each individual shot. And then basically Peter Dalton will do a motion control program which will have the basic move of the figure through the frame. If he's moving fast or slow, if he's going in and out of frame, if he starts from a couple of miles away to flying right up into the frame. And after that is done, and we have a good program that everybody's happy with, I will go in between frames and make little moves, move the head, move the arms, move the legs, move it, shoot a frame of film, move it again, shoot a frame of film. Some of these shots, they might take 3 or 4 hours to do. Some of them take half an hour. It all depends on the complexity of the shot. I actually kind of try to imagine if it was me with this huge like fireball essentially strapped onto my back, and it's all bound by the laws of physics. There are certain things he can do. He can fly 100 miles an hour. He can't fly 1,000 miles an hour, or else he'd be torn, limb from limb. So I just kind of try to do what would look natural.
It's pretty cool when you get into the nuts and bolts of it and how they made it look, and especially in a pre-CGI world. And I love miniatures. There's something charming about that old school way of doing things, right? And I don't know. I thought it worked out really well. One special effect I thought was phenomenal, actually, was the end with the big Zeppelin explosion. The Zeppelin special effect cost about $400,000 to make, and there's this great scene where our heroes are running on top of the Zeppelin as it's exploding behind them, and that looks phenomenal. That is very, very, very impressive. I would say even to this day. So I think a lot of this, because it's so practical, because they did so much in camera, and I think it's because you buy so much into the characters that you don't particularly care about when it gets wonky. You know what I mean?
Well, no, not only do you not care, but again, spoiler, but Jesus. Guess what, folks? The bad guy loses. Neville Sinclair's final moment in this, the moment of his defeat, is not the best special effect, but it's it just makes me laugh every time. It's so perfect, right? Dalton's performance as he realizes the jetpack is exploding on him, and just it's just so silly, and it doesn't look great, but it's so perfect, and it's exactly the end you want for that character, because it's exactly what he deserves, So you forgive the special effects if the moment is still working on a thematic or emotional level.
And you know why it looks so good in camera, Trev, is because the cinematographer is Hiro Narita, the Star Trek VI cinematographer. So same year. So there's
hey, look at that.
Moment. Yeah, I know. I had to add it to you.
Well, speaking of the Zeppelin part, Chris, I wanted to ask you something now. So let's talk, and this goes into special effects as well, because now let's talk about special effects makeup. Because, all the characters in this are pretty much, they look like regular people. They look like the actors they are. And then suddenly, at a certain point in the movie, Neville Sinclair hires a goon to go after Secord and get the rocket pack back. And that character's named Lothar. And this character shows up, and suddenly it's did we just suddenly start watching Dick Tracy? What's going on here?
Yeah.
And I wanted to ask you, Chris, if you were aware of why Lothar looks the way he does, and what he is a nod to. Did you get this at all, or no?
No, I just assumed because it was some pulp hero stuff. I didn't really put much thought into it.
So he's not a pulp hero. So Lothar is actually designed to look exactly like a real life actor named Rondo Hatton. So Rondo Hatton in the 30s was a journalist who actually, when he was in high school, he was voted the most handsome boy in high school. He was a football hero. He went on to be a journalist. And unfortunately, he ended up, early in life, he had an affliction called acromegalia, which acromegalia is when you have excessive growth hormone in your body. And it manifests typically as an enlargement of your feet, hands, forehead, jaw, and nose. And that's what happened to Rondo Hatton. So while he was a journalist, suddenly he came down with this, and it completely changed the way he looked. And he ended up looking exactly like Lothar looks. That makeup design is an exact match of Rondo Hatton. And he was a character from the comics because David Stevens, again, going back to the movies he loved of his youth and everything, just remembered Rondo Hatton. So because what happened is once he looked like that, people spotted him. and said, with a face like that, you should be in the movies. And he was kind of hesitant at first, but ultimately he said, okay, I'll do it. And not surprisingly, Hollywood in the 30s and 40s, not the most sensitive place. So they said, well, because you look like that, you're going to be the scary monster, or the scary henchman in all of our movies. And that's pretty much what he did throughout the 30s. He did a bunch of bit parts where he was like the heavy. And right at the end of his acting career in the last few years, he started to kind of be known, and he would be the face on the poster. He had a run of 3 movies. In 1944, he made a movie called The Pearl of Death. And then in 46, he had House of Horrors and The Brute Man. And in all of those, he was credited as the Creeper. And it kind of became like his character, right? It wasn't necessarily like, it's kind of like that bizarre continuity where it's not necessarily the same guy in each movie, but he was always called the Creeper. It was kind of making him like, this Rondo Hatton is the Creeper. Come see the new Creeper movie with Rondo Hatton. Unfortunately, acromegaly did end up giving him a series of heart attacks, and he died shortly after that in his 50s. But he's remembered today by horror fans. There's like the Rondo Awards are like the horror podcasting and magazine awards and everything. So I thought it's cool that they did that. Actually, it might. I was just kind of curious what you thought of that, because he definitely, if you don't know that, he maybe sticks out like a sore thumb in the movie a little bit, but he is like a nod to another like kind of classic Hollywood lore thing.
That's cool. I didn't know that at all. I did just kind of take it at face value though. It's I thought it worked in the world. Like I said, it was kind of reality adjacent, right? With this,
and of course he's played by Tiny Ron Taylor, who we all know as Mehardu in Star Trek Deep Space Nine. Hello, is anyone there still? There? Can I like not to just keep harping on Lothar, but one quick thing, Chris. This is the other one I wanted to bring up. This is the other moment where the movie is so much better than the graphic novel, in my opinion. Because I talked about how I thought in the graphic novel Cliff Secord is a little unlikable. Well, you can even cut this out if you want. I don't know if you find this very interesting, but in the comic book, Lothar is in there. He's in the second storyline.
Okay.
But he's completely different. He's not a hired goon of Neville Sinclair in the comic. He's a serial killer who is coming after Cliff Secord and all of the people that Cliff Secord used to be in a traveling like carnival freak show with. So it's revealed that when Cliff Secord was younger, he was part of a escape artists act in a traveling carnival. And Cliff Secord would go in the water, and then this escape artist would jump in and save him. And there is a little person, a woman who's a little person, who Lothar has a crush on, who's also part of the carnival. But she likes Cliff. And she asks Cliff out, but Cliff doesn't take her seriously, and he goes off with another girl instead. And because he's out with this other girl, when the act is supposed to be going on, they're like, where's Cliff? He's supposed to go in the water. And the little girl, she wants to impress Cliff, so she says, well, I'll do it. And she gets in the water, but because her lungs are so tiny, she drowns because she can't hold her breath as long. And that drives Lothar insane. And he ends up killing everybody in the carnival. And then years later, he's still coming for revenge and tracking down the last remaining people. And Cliff is one of them. So that's, and the thing is that that story, not only is that super dark, just in general, but they never have Cliff show any remorse for the way he treated the little person. And for her death, it's just ugh. So again, just the kind of thing where hats off to the writers for being like, you know what, actually, let's just make him a more generic kind of heavy and take that whole part out of Cliff's backstory.
Instead, we made him, like a giant monster man that crushes people in half.
But see, that's exactly what Rondo Hatton was in the movies. So again, that actually, he very much is just the creeper in this. So I dig it. Yeah.
Cool.
And then speaking of characters, Chris, I know we're going to start wrapping up, but I alluded to this earlier. I don't know about you, but man, do I love a superhero movie where the superhero has a bunch of friends that are helping him
totally.
out. The entire gang at the diner. First of all, the woman who runs the diner, Millie, Margot Martindale, one of our greatest character actors today, in only her second movie. I think she had done Days of Thunder the year before. This is her second film. But I love this whole cast. It's the great William Sanderson from Blade Runner and Deadwood's in there. They're just also likable. They're also fun in just these tiny little roles. And heck, they hang out in a diner that looks like a bulldog. How cool is that? Mm-hmm. I would be there every day. That place rules.
It just makes the town feel so lived in, right? And it adds to that charm that we talked about, that old school Americana. That kind of everybody knows their neighbor and this and that, and they go to the you mentioned the diner, and I love that. It's a point of contention a little bit from Jenny that they always go there to eat all the time. And she's like, well, can we try different places? She kind of wants to break free of that, small town atmosphere, but she's still homegrown at heart. She aspires to maybe a little bit more fancy stuff, but yet totally fits in with that band of people, you know?
Yeah, they rule.
I guess the other thing to mention is, I mentioned his name earlier, but James Horner's score, me and Trevor, big James Horner fans. We're big score whores, as they call us. James Horner, we talked a lot about during our Karate Kid remake episode, and that guy, he had an amazing career. I know a lot of people gave him shit over the years when he was alive, that he kind of just reuses a lot of stuff. First off, I think most composers are doing that, but I feel that the lifeblood to the Rocketeer and what holds it all together, as much as we love so much of this and pretty much everything, the score is the glue to, I think, everything. It brings you home to that old school Americana. It brings you to that classic Hollywood feel. It makes it gives you that earnest feeling when you're watching these characters interact, and you take everything so damn seriously because of the beautiful motifs that are playing throughout the entire picture. It's a really good one. I'm gonna add it to my Apple Music right away. So it's very, very
well. You know what I realized watching it this time, and I don't think I ever had this revelation before. And actually, I know why I never had this revelation, because I think any other time I'd watched this in the past, particularly when I was a kid, I didn't know that James Horner was also a pilot. Now, unfortunately, I do know that for the worst reasons, right? Yeah. Unfortunately, we lost James Horner in a single passenger or single pilot plane crash. But yeah, he was a pilot. He loved aviation, and this is an aviation movie. And then you watch this and you listen to that score and just how beautiful it is and how soaring it is, and you realize, oh, this was his opportunity to make an aviation movie score. You know, and because this movie is very much in the tradition of those old Howard Hughes aviation movies, and it's very much playing to the spirit of that, the spirit of aviation. So his passion, what he loves, he got to score a film all about that, and I think it really comes across in just how classic and as you said, beautiful the music is.
Yeah, no, he makes flying seem wondrous. That's how I wrote down. So, R.I.P. James Horner.
Yes, for sure.
Now, going back to what Trev had said before, that Disney doesn't really know what to do with this property, well, my God. The amount of times they've tried or stumbled or thought about it or leaked things to the press or got things going, quite a bit. We're going back to 2012. Disney is reported to be remaking it by James Wan, by the way, the Saw creator, which... I would sign up for that. I'd watch that.
Yeah.
Seems odd, but obviously he had a take. That quickly fell apart. In July 2016, they are going to now reboot it again as the Rocketeers. Now, this one had some producers in the name of athletes. I thought this was strange. Blake Griffin of the Brooklyn Nets and Ryan Khalil of the Carolina Panthers. This would be a reboot sequel that takes place 6 years after the original film with a black female pilot in the lead. Let's come back to that in a second. But then let's flash forward to July 2019, where, did you know this at all, by the way? They had a one-season animated TV series on Disney Junior, starring Billy Campbell as Cliff. Did you know about this?
Well, okay, so here's the thing. This goes back to what I said about the way Disney treats this property, because it was very telling to me that when we decided to do this episode and when we were doing the research, and I was like, oh, cool, I get to watch The Rocketeer again. I haven't watched it in years. And I was like, I get to do some research, I'll reread some of the comics. And then in my head, I go, I wonder whatever happened to that Rocketeer show they said they were going to do. I wonder why that never happened. So I'm like, I'll go look and see why that didn't happen. What? It did happen. It had a 22 episode season. So no, I did not know. But Chris, as you probably won't be surprised, because I always do this, sat down this morning, watched the pilot. Yeah. I will correct you on one little thing. Billy Campbell is in it, but I think I think he just has one line as Cliff in a newsreel footage.
Oh,
but he actually plays a different character. He plays, so the main character of the Rocketeer cartoon is Kit Secor, who is a young girl, a very little girl. I don't know what her age. I think she's 8 or 9, and she is Cliff Secor's great granddaughter. And she ends up in this continuity. It's the continuity of the film. The Rocketeer is a legend. In that same town, there's a statue of him in the town square now. The Bulldog Diner is still there, but it's kind of been more town has been built around it. And her mom runs that diner, and her dad is Cliff Secord's grandson, and that's who Billy Campbell plays. So he plays her dad.
Okay.
And she like loves the Rocketeer. She doesn't know that she's related to the Rocketeer, but she like loves like the legend of him. And then she ends up finding the rocket pack, and she becomes like a child version of the Rocketeer. And it wasn't very good. I thought what was like frustrating about it is I read that it was like pitched at the target audience was 2 to 5, and it very much has that. So I'm like not the target audience, to be fair,
Yeah,
but
it went to Disney Junior.
Yeah. And it has that like, you'll know exactly what I'm talking about even without seeing it. It has that like lame CGI look to it that it look, those like CGI movies that come out that are like straight to video. They're like ripoffs of like bigger CG movies.
Like VeggieTales?
Yes. It like looks like one of those, and yeah, the humor is like pretty weak or whatever. And I really don't like, there's a moment where she finds the original Rocketeer helmet, but then I don't know, Michael Eisner finally got his wish. She designs like a new helmet that completely shows her face. She just kind of wears goggles, and then she wears like a purple helmet with the fin. And it's just like, whatever. I guess it's, if any kids liked it, more power to them. It just wasn't for me. But It's just, I didn't even know it had happened. It had got a full season.
Well, now we go to January 2020, where they announced that they're actually scripting a sequel here, with J.D. Dillard set to direct. We'll come back to him in a second. We flash forward to August 2021, the return of the Rocketeer, with David Oyelowo and his wife Jessica serving as producers. This was going to be more about a former Tuskegee airman who inherits the rocket pack. And then in November 2022, J.D. Dillard drops out, and it's because he just kind of did an aviation movie called Devotion, which came out last year. Yeah. So oddly enough, we did get some recent, at least talk of an update of what was going on. Some interesting ideas here. Me and Trev actually we are actually huge fans of a certain YouTube channel, Red Letter Media. We've mentioned them a couple times in this podcast, but they actually did a retrospective review on this film. And one of the hosts, Mike Stoklasa, it's one of his favorite films. So we want to give credit where credit's due, and Trev will take the reins from here, but he kind of pitches an interesting idea for a sequel that is almost a blend of the almost reboot, remake sequels that happened.
Well, that's what I want to mention. It was kind of impressive because he talks about how in the video, because the video is a few years old now, he says that he had just seen the rumor that they might do a new Rocketeer with a black female lead. And he's talking about how he doesn't even really believe it. He just thinks it's clickbait, probably just done to, drive trolls crazy.
Yeah.
But then he talks about how he was just so taken with that idea, and he actually loves the idea. And he pitches a sequel that I would love to see, where he says in his the pitch he comes up with is setting it in 1977 in New York City during the big famous blackout. There's a famous blackout that lasted for days in New York City, and it's at the same time that the Son of Sam was on the loose, so everyone was just on edge. Mm-hmm. There was garbage in the streets and riots, and he pictures a young black woman finding the rocket pack, because that's also the year after Howard Hughes died. And I guess the idea is that Howard Hughes would have, him and Peavy would have built another one of the packs. And it's it's among Howard Hughes's possession, and she somehow comes across it. He doesn't fully flesh out the idea, but he talks about how he thinks that because the movie, the original Rocketeer is set in 1938, and it's made to feel like a 1930s serial, what you would do is if you set the new one in 1977, you would make it feel like a 70s movie.
Yeah.
So he says, why not make it feel like a blaxploitation movie? And have the new Rocketeer be this kind of hip, young Pam Grier-esque character. And I just always remember he has this great moment where he says the imagery that came to his head was her walking into Studio 54, at its height, with the Rocketeer helmet on, and then taking the helmet off and her afro just poofing out of the helmet. And I love that. And I love Pam Grier. I love the Pam Grier blaxploitation movies. And he even says she could walk by Andy Warhol. Andy Warhol's ooh, what's that fancy helmet you got? And he's taken by the Art Deco design of it. And I just love that idea of setting different Rocketeer movies in different time periods and aping the style of that time.
Totally.
But what I thought was kind of impressive, and it made me really wonder, you and I have talked a lot about how some of these more popular YouTube channels, how much Hollywood pays attention to them. they do, like in his discussion there when he's like pitching it, I think he even just kind of throws out like maybe she's like the daughter of a Tuskegee Airman or something. You know, he just says that. And then sure enough, you said a couple years later, they say, we're making a new Rocketeer movie and it's about the Tuskegee Airman who gets the helmet. I was like, I wonder if they like watched that and said like, let's take that idea. I don't know, feeding off of that, the David Oyelowo one, I'm down for that. I like that idea. I like the Tuskegee Airman connection. I think it's a really clever idea. I also, there was, you know, you said that David Oyelowo and his wife are attached as producers, but there was also discussion he might star in it. I really like him as an actor, and he is another actor who I feel like has been waiting for his big single breakout.
Right.
So I would definitely be down for him playing the Rocketeer. I just don't think it's going to happen.
Yeah, I that's what I was about to say. I mean, I loved this movie. Like, I really did. And like I said, top tier of failure to franchise, without a doubt. Yeah. And I'm going to revisit it. I wish that Blu-ray was way better, or else I would buy it right away. But, you know, maybe I'll wait on it. But I don't trust Disney at all.
Yeah.
Like, I hate to sound so cynical when we're talking about a completely uncynical movie, but I don't see this movie coming off charming or made with miniatures, and it would absolutely be contemporary, right?
Yeah.
And it'll all be filmed in a dome, and it'll be complete green screen gobbledygook, and there will be no charm.
Yeah. Well, and it's just not going to happen because all those, you know, the Rocketeers and the Return of the Rocketeer, those were all announced and talked about during either the late days of the first Bob Iger era or the Bob Chapek era, right?
Totally.
And that's when Disney was like most IP obsessed. They were just like, any IP, you know, people love IP. Yeah, sure, the Rocketeer, that's an IP. People know that name. People remember that. But in the last few months with Iger's return, we've seen him publicly start to talk about how Disney's going to scale back. We're not doing as well as we thought. We're going to start closing those purse strings a little bit. And I don't think he's not in the same rush as he used to be to exploit every IP. And the Rocketeer, I just don't think is popular enough for them to even bother with now. Like, because I think if anything, they were already looking at it that like, oh, maybe the Return of the Rocketeer with David Oyelowo will be like a Disney Plus original. But I don't think they're even like leaning into that anymore, as these streamers are all starting to, you know, sputter and flail. So yeah, it's not going to happen.
And also,
I'd be surprised if it does, I'll say.
Well, and also they just have so much going on with the MCU. Like, even if they pull the reins back a little bit, right, budgetary-wise or content-wise, they still have an endless amount of characters and stories, right? Mm-hmm. So, like, why would you, in the era of the MCU, when you own all this shit, plus all the Fox stuff now, and, I mean, somewhat of the Sony stuff in a weird way, but why even start with a Rocketeer that lives outside of that continuity? For some strange reason, I feel like maybe nothing surprises me anymore. So does Disney try to place the Rocketeer in the MCU? Like, you know what I mean? Like, do they get that crazy? Does it become that Patton Oswalt speech from Parks and Rec where just everything collides with each other?
Well, dude, I legit had that thought because like there are some pulp heroes who have been, if not absorbed into like the Marvel or DC, they've at least been allowed to like cross over. Like the Shadow, who we'll be looking at next time, for instance, has had comics where he meets Batman. Okay. You know, I don't think that's ever happened with the Rocketeer. I believe the current, at least in the comic front, the current publisher that has the rights to the Rocketeer is IDW, and they have done some new Rocketeer miniseries, including one, Chris, where they teamed him up with another pulp hero that we're not looking at this time, but we'll probably look at when we do another pulp run later, the Spirit. And I wanted to bring that up because the name of their crossover comic was the Rocketeer Spirit Pulp Friction, which is what you wanted to call this event, and I fought for Pulp Frustration. But no, I was actually going to say, like, probably the best thing that could have happened to the Rocketeer character on a like business level for it to getting more movies would have been if he could have been absorbed into DC or Marvel. I'm glad he wasn't.
Yeah,
but that's probably the only way we actually would have got any more traction and movement on a real, you know, return to the Rocketeer. I think if he's just continues to be a more ancillary side publisher character, there's no rush for any studio to like get back to this, unfortunately.
No. And again, especially right now with all these streamers tightening their purse strings and figuring out what to do next and canceling things here left and right. I think we are in an age of I mean, we are obvious. Well, yeah, totally, right? Like, we're in an age of franchises right now, but I don't see a major studio like Disney taking even the mildest of chances with something like Rocketeer. Like, even if it went straight to Disney Plus, I mean, looking at the Disney remakes, and I don't know. I just really don't. I think we're in a really strange place with franchises that either, I mean, this is it, right? Like, this is it. It would take big budget blockbusters.
It would take a bigger star than David Oyelowo to speak up and say, you know what, I love that character. Can I do a Rocketeer movie? And unfortunately, because of the performance of this movie, I doubt that there are many stars who are chomping at the bit to play the Rocketeer.
Well, and also we go back to what we said before. What are movie stars anymore? You know,
right.
What stars sell movies if you're not Tom Cruise? I mean, hell, Tom Cruise is the Rocketeer. I'd fucking watch that in a heartbeat. But he basically is the Rocketeer. Well, this is a weird one because the film is so good and so earnest and so well-mannered, and I feel like this is just too old-fashioned. I don't foresee movies like this being made. Honestly, fuck, I don't know. I don't want to use the word ever again, but it certainly feels that way. This one's too hopeful in a world we live in now. You know what I mean? Like, I don't know what other hopeful films are going to be coming out. You know, a lot of movies are built in the times that they are, and right now the world is in fucking weird disarray and chaos and feelings of brinks of war and this and that, and I feel like a Rocketeer film would just feel misplaced and not what really what people want. Maybe it's what people need, but not what they want.
No, and not even on just like the hopeful, thematic level of it, but even stylistically, it felt old-fashioned when it came out. You know, like, this is a 1991 movie, and this is right when, 91 is also the year of Terminator 2. Right. This is the year that things started to transition over to CGI, explosions, morphing, everything's big, everything's huge, So this movie was like a movie out of time even when it came out. But that's also its strength, All I can say is the movie didn't do well, it didn't have the lasting impact Disney hoped for. But on a creative level, I think you have to look at this as a success for Joe Johnston, Danny Bilson, Paul DeMeo, and Dave Stevens. This is exactly the movie they wanted to make. Yeah. It is a throwback film that is set in 1938, and it feels like it was made in 1938. It feels like the old pulps, and that's always going to speak to a certain kind of niche audience. You and I are obviously part of that. It'll continue to have a cult audience. Unfortunately, I don't see it getting any bigger than that. But yeah, like I said, if you are put off at all by the cynicism and the visual CGI barf of modern comic book movies, this is a nice antidote. This is a nice to just sit down and be like, oh, this is such a good classic Hollywood, out of time, out of step, but in a good way movie to go back and revisit. And maybe it's a good thing we never got any sequels or anything, and it gets to exist as this little singular thing, Yeah. I could have seen it getting worse and getting watered down as a franchise too. So
that's also true. That's also true. Joe Johnston is just a very optimistic filmmaker.
Joe Johnston, I think I'm sure we talked about this with the Wolfman episode, but he gets a lot of crap as people call him like a journeyman director, and I get why, because he's jumped into a lot of things, but I think when you look at this and Captain America, even like some of the stylism of the Wolfman, he has a take. Obviously, he is a director who is maybe, he's obviously a special effects guy, as you said, as an ILM guy. But I think what he believes in and like what he holds dear to heart in terms of character and emotion, he's a filmmaker of the wrong era.
Totally.
Like he's out of time himself, and that speaks to me. I like that. But yeah, I think he's better than a journeyman director. I like Joe Johnston.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah. Well, that'll about do it for what is this movie?
All right, Disney.
Let me say that again. Well, that'll about do it for the Rocketeer. Just awesome. Loved it.
Yeah.
Loved it. Going further into Pulp Frustration or Pulp Friction, we're looking at, as Travis said a couple times, The Shadow from 1994, and then we'll be finishing off with The Phantom from 1996. What I find funny about these pulp heroes, they're all starting with the.
Well, not the Dick Tracy.
Well, the Dick. I would have liked that. But yeah, like you even said, The Spirit is coming up, so one day.
Well, here's the promise I'll make to you, Chris, and you're recording it, so this is on record. Because we still have more of these after this event. We have The Spirit, we've got, Solomon Kane, we've got some Lone Ranger movies. When we do another one of these, we'll call it Pulp Friction.
Cool. Thank you. Thank you. So yes, follow along at F2F Pod. That's at F2, the number 2 F Pod on all the socials. Like us there, like us everywhere. Rate, review, whatever you do. Star rating would be cool. And just join the tribe, hit that subscribe, and follow along with our Pulp Frustration. So far, it has been very, very good, and I've been very happy. So,
well, we'll see if the Shadow and the Phantom bring you down to earth a little bit.
Yeah, we'll see.
And if you're a huge Hollywood producer listening to this show, throw Billy Campbell a leading role in something. Do it for us.
Shazam 3.
Well, I was going to aim a little higher, but